Another program, this is actually a program I did with, that is mainly the work of Ian Bogus and RB6502, a Montreal demo scener. And I just stood over them and, kept them by the computer for the most part. But I worked with them to create first this program, which is a re-implementation of the basic program as Commodore 64 assembly. So we didn't, not wanting to use the basic specific rand function, we set the third voice of the SID, the sound interface device, the sound chip for the C64, to noise, and had to and then increase the speed. And there's actually then a register that you can load values from that contains more or less random numbers, since you're using the noise output of the sound chip to generate them. For the rest, we use the we did, however, use the kernel routine to do output. So the output looks the same way. It skips up 2 lines at a time. It does everything, quite similarly. But that's not a basic. That char out routine is not specific to BASIC. It's part of the Commodore 64 kernel. So we made use of that. And you get something that does basically the same thing. I mean, most of the time is actually taken in the char out routine. So this program might be faster than the basic one, but it doesn't matter so much. And then we expanded this. I don't think I'll show this right now, but we expanded this into a 32-byte demo for the Commodore 64, which uses the 0 page of the C64 as a color table to go through and decorate the output with random colors, basically. All right. So let me just, I want to wrap up with something that perhaps isn't as technical. I want to, and then we might have time for a few questions, which Michael, as a co-author on this project, has agreed to join me for. How is it that something like this, a very abstract image, might mean something to us? What significance would it have? So I want you to imagine an offensive desktop background or screensaver. Something that if you saw it in your lab, you would go to talk to Noah or Michael and ask that it be dealt with, and that this is something that you can do this, right? You can think of something that's offensive. I prefer for you to use your own imagination rather than for me to display something which may or may not offend you enough. Okay? But the point is, if you can think of something that does offend you, then that probably is a good sign that a screensaver can have meaning. It can actually convey something to you. And then believing that screensavers do have semantics, and they have connotations, and they mean things, we might ask, well, what does this mean? What does a screensaver like this mean? It's sort of funny screensaver, I think. I mean, you find this is sort of amusing, like the fish tank screensaver, yes? And why is it funny?
I would actually spend money to buy a screensaver.
Well, that would be, yes, that'd be one possibility.
The human experience of sitting in front of a computer doesn't evoke wonder.
What's that?
Because the human experience of sitting in front of a computer all day isn't fantastic.
So for one thing, it's showing you like living creatures, which maybe it's more interesting to watch a fish than to watch a computer in a certain way, right? Maybe there is some element of wonder there. I mean, I would say one of the reasons that this is so wry and amusing is because it sort of suggests this.
Right.
Right? It actually suggests that your monitor, and actually this is much more effective in the CRT era than it is in the flat screen era. But it suggests that your monitor, it doesn't really suggest, it reminds you that your monitor is a piece of furniture. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, you're not thinking of that. It's a beautiful glowing portal that is like, the internet, it's so awesome. But actually, it's basically something that could contain a fish, like instead of what it's doing. Mm-hmm. There's also, I think, a good argument that the earliest sort of screensaver was developed by Marcel Duchamp. His rotoreliefs from 1933 are records. They're basically like discs that go onto a 33 1/3 RPM record player, and they produce different images. Some of them geometric images. They move around. They're for you to take your device when it's not in use for its primary purpose, which is for playing music, and instead put on this disc and have a visual display on it. And it was a pack of 6 with just like a screensaver pack, with one on each side. And he even had a fishbowl. He had a fish. Japanese fish was one of them that had a fish on it that would swim around. It was a top-down view of the fishbowl. So Duchamp invented if he didn't invent the screensaver, he certainly invented the fish tank. So, you can take a look at things like this, and what do they mean, right? What does it mean to have a endless, bewildering, monolithic, hegemonic journey inside a brick maze? Why would Windows be presenting you with something like that? I don't know. What does it mean to see? I mean, who are these guys? They're sort of like technological constructs, but they have zoomorphic attributes. They have wings and they're flying, and the other thing is that this overall may in fact be what the computer is dreaming, right, in its sleep time, because it's being displayed as a screensaver. So, and then really when you start thinking about the Matrix, oh, that's so cool. But what does it mean to have your screensaver be a Matrix screensaver? What type of stance is that taking about artificial intelligence and computing and the way people relate to computers? I mean, I think there's a sinister edge, to say the least, in suggesting something like this. But this also suggests a particular property and storyline that goes beyond, this abstract play of symbols that you see here. Right? So, one of the things, the tin-print program that I showed you is not a screensaver. In fact, it is produced before the word screensaver is coined, which is in 1983. But it is like one in certain ways. And so one of the things you might do is say, well, which screensavers, relate to it more closely, and which is it, unlike. And even though this actually is a literal maze, I think it's not very much like this, because it's giving you this top-down perspective of seeing a maze continually constructed that you have a view of, you have command of, and it's not trapping you in that maze the way that this screensaver is doing. I actually think it's much more like the Pipes screensaver, which is furiously constructing, interesting to look at, although not always utilitarian, sorts of figures here, and three-dimensional configurations, and then those disappear and it starts over again, right? And so it is, I would say, though, making a certain point about the computer, which is that it is an industrious machine. It is always building, it's thinking, it creates structures, creates architectures, right? Which is not what that is saying, which is not what this is saying, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's worthwhile looking at that. But I also think that consideration of these sorts of things has to relate to all the other investigations of how a program like this is a basic program, a Commodore 64 program. It's rooted in computing history. It's connected to the practices of programmers, people trading things in magazines, and it illustrates things about the basics of programs that can be used for aesthetic and cultural and social impact. All right, so thank you very much. If you have some questions, I'll see if Michael and I can talk to them.
I have a very simple question. So I'm not familiar with Commodore 64 Basic. Why is it 205.5? Why not just 205?
Oh, so in this case, let me bring up the emulator and try to explain, actually,
okay.
Because it's a nice thing. Let's see here. So here's 205.5. Okay. So that's the program as we know it, right? And if I were to just change it to 205, we would get this.
And every once in a while print out the other kind.
No, in
Oh,
that case,
because it's a number,
yeah, what
it's a
you've done
floating
here
point
is-
between 0 and 1.
is that yeah,
Okay.
you're selecting a number between 205 and 206.
Right.
And then that number is being truncated, and so it's always going to be truncated to 205. Then but what your question also brings up that if we wanted to, like, well, what if we have 205.1, right? Right? And so there
Okay.
we have something which almost always chooses the left-leaning diagonal, but one time in 10, it will choose the other. And so then we get you can change the distribution
Mhm.
just by changing what that decimal point is. Right?
And this sort of raises an interesting point that in Commodore 64 Basic, all arithmetic is floating point arithmetic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're doing integer arithmetic internally, it's actually getting turned into, much slower floating point first, and then the floating point arithmetic is done. And so this is sort of exploiting, being able to sort of, add these numbers together to then produce a value which gets interpreted as a character, is kind of exploiting this common denominator of all things, all numbers are floats. That's a property of C64 Basic.